Hello everyone, welcome to my second video about mono-white heroic in Pauper. In my first video I was talking a lot about how the heroic should be built, what's the basic concept of the deck, what are the different variations of the archetype, what are the pros and cons and so on. In today's video I will talk a bit more about my findings, how the deck can be upgraded, and what I expect to see at the next Paupergeddon. And of course, thank you for watching my previous video. And if you want to see some, let's say, more detailed content, you can check the links below. When there's an updated sideboard guide for the heroic. So if you plan to play this deck at, for example, Paupergeddon, you can go and check it out. Okay, let's focus on our video. Okay, so in terms of the positioning of the metagame, in my opinion, 3 months ago heroic was wonderfully positioned because there was a lot of mono red madness, blue terror, and elves decks, so 3 mono decks that aren't interacting that hard with our plan, or at least their interaction didn't match up with what we are trying to do. Also, snuff out decks were on a decline. So, at least in online meta, because the online and paper meta can change a bit, but in the online meta on MTGO it was super easy to grind. With the deck I had like over 70% win rate. But over time it got a bit harder, mostly because the metagame has changed a bit. The decks like Blue Black Fairies, which is a super bad matchup for heroic, or Cowgates, which is okay, but it's kind of challenging, got some more popularity. So there were already signs that heroic won't be as greatly positioned as it was before. And after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles set got spoiled, heroic got hit by 2 new trends. First was the rise of mono-white decks, thanks to the Leo brothers, like the 3 mana turtle that's played in White Sweeney, and because of it, White Sweeney plays more, and this is somewhat changing matchup for the heroic, mostly because of the color of the deck. If it's a mono-white deck, then our protection spells that you should technically give us unblockable can mess up with our game plan. More about this in the primer. The second change was the addition of Utro Monitor to the affinity, and by doing so the matchup became more or less even, because there are more flying creatures, so they can generate more tempo, and also they can block with creatures with 2 colors. So they have like Familiar, which is black, and Utro Monitor, which is blue. So it's a bit harder to lock them out of the game with the protection spells. But overall, in my opinion, heroic is still a solid choice, because still Madness, Terror, and Elves are at the top of the meta. And there are still a bunch of decks which are either very good or very bad matchups that they kind of balance out. So, in my opinion, if I could say that heroic was 9 out of 10 3 months ago, now it's a solid 7 out of 10, and I still think it's solid, but you need to play it really well and build it really well. And speaking of building, how we can do this? Okay, this is the list from my previous update. If you want to check it out, you can just stop the video and see. And this is my new one. Okay, what are the changes? It's adding 4 remote farms, mostly because it's just a better version of the planes for the deck. And the other changes are because of how the metagame changed, not because of my findings about that something is much better than anything else. So in my opinion, I don't want to say that the deck is solved, but I would be very surprised if the deck will evolved very hard. Okay, let's talk about Remote Farm. In my opinion, Remote Farm is OP and you should always play 4 copies. Why? Mostly because the jump from the 2 to 3 mana on turn 2 is huge, especially with 8 out of 12 threats being 2 drops. So essentially, in an aggro deck, you want to play a 1 drop on turn 1 into 2 drop or 2 1 drops on turn 2. In Heroic, it looks a bit differently because 2 of our 3 creatures cost 2 mana. So our first land drop isn't that used anyway. Like outside Laguna Trailblazer, it's super hard to use this mana effectively. So playing a tap land that will give you 2 mana on turn 2 is extremely good, because if you count how much mana planes can produce in the first 3 turns of the game, it's actually only 2, or 1 on turn 2, 1 on turn 3. With Remote Farm you can produce up to 4 mana, which is just phenomenal because the rest of the deck is just a bunch of 1 drops, so it's super easy to get ahead on tempo and rush the opponent with everything you have. And there are also some minor upsides. For example, it's a card in a graveyard that can be used for Sentinel's Eyes escape ability, or for example you can produce more mana to pay for a Spell Pierce or something like this, but it's a minor advantage. Generally speaking, generating more mana early in this deck is super good, and if you are afraid of losing the land, imagine that you borrowed on turn 2 and 3, you borrowed the mana from turn 1 and from turn 4 to play the same spells earlier, and the result should always be that you are killing the opponent on either turn 4 or turn 5. So losing this land shouldn't be the biggest problem ever, at least in the Goldfish games. That being said, losing the land can be a problem. That's why I decided to add that 18th land to the deck. That's why I'm playing 4 Remote Farms and 14 planes. Okay, Lawrence Escape, and it's 1-1 split. In the previous update, I was playing 1 Lawrence Escape in the sideboard, mostly as an answer to white decks with Journey to Nowhere. And because of the rise of the Cowgates, which plays Journey to Nowhere, I decided to add Lawrence Escape to the main deck. It's also solid against snuff out decks, anything with mass removal, or if you, for example, play against Affinity, they block your flying creature with the flying creature of their own and give it Death Touch with Toxin Analysis. This can be somewhat problematic, but with Roland's Escape you have yet another answer to this kind of play. If you aren't the biggest fan of the Lawrence Escape but you want some similar option, you can also play Blacksmith Skill. For example, you can protect auras, which can be useful, for example, against Jant when they sometimes attack your, for example, Eternal Armor or Hyena Umbra. So you can use Blacksmith Skill to use it effectively. But objectively, in my opinion, Scry 1 is better than this minor upsides of protecting your auras from disenchant effects. There are also other changes, very slight ones, but I think they are worth mentioned. Because I wanted to make room for the 18th land and Lawrence Escape, I had to cut something. The first one card was something that gives vigilance, because the first card that gives vigilance is really good. It helps you generate, maybe not generate the tempo, but not lose the tempo, or not let the opponent to get into a situation when they can tempo you out. Because if you attack with a big creature and keep the same creature to the blocks, then it's super hard for any opponent that tries to play fair to keep up. But the first vigilance card is super good, but the second one does close to nothing outside just pumping your creature. So in my opinion, this is the easiest cut. I'm still not sure if I should cut Homestead Carriage or Sentinel Eyes. For now, I'm a bit closer to cutting one Homestead Carriage, so I'm actively sacrificing a bit of my, let's say, long game by having a card with a flashback. And in exchange, I want to have my creature have vigilance a bit more often. So a bit more often for longer than just one turn. So for example, if I'm playing against other creature decks like White Winnie or Affinity or Elves or basically anything else that is focused on attacking, then having vigilance is a solid thing to have. I also decided to trim one Spirit Link, mostly because this is a very hit or miss card. Sometimes it's phenomenal, for example against Red Madness, it just wins games. It's also solid against another creature decks, but for example, if you're playing versus Jant or Cowgate or any combo deck, Spirit Link rarely does anything, maybe outside winning the game that would be won anyway. So I decided to trim it a bit. Okay, and the last point of my deck changes is the sideboard. There are two important changes. Somewhat important. Okay, I decided to switch Sokka's Sword Training and add Yip Yip instead. These two effects are very similar. One costs 2 mana, gives you +2/+2 and a clue token. The other one costs 1 mana, gives you also +2/+2, but without the clue. So is the decision between tempo and card advantage. Based from my testing, I was more inclined to use Yip Yip than Sokka's Sword Training, mostly because I not always had time to crack the clue and then use the value I got from this extra clue. So I decided to just go lower to the ground and try to kill the opponent out of nowhere, especially in lower source games, when I, for example, have to play on 1 or 2 lands, which can happen from time to time, especially with Remote Farm being sacrificed in the early stages of the game. I also decided to cut one lifelink because Spirit Link, in my opinion, is just a better lifelink effect for the deck, mostly because of how the meta looks like. For example, you can Spirit Link the Gutter Snipe to stop their triggers to matter, or for example, when opponent plays Guru Makangler or something like this, you can just enchant this and neutralize this way of attack for the opponent. I'm playing now 5 lifelink effects and I would love to play more, but it's super hard for me to find more slots. If I knew that the Paupergeddon meta will be like 30% of Madness, I would for sure play 6. And for example, cut Journey to Nowhere or Fairy Macabre, but I'm not sure if that would be the case. That's why I'm playing only 5 copies, and I rely on either the tempo and protections or just drawing the first lifelink. That should be enough most of the time. Okay, moving forward. Journey to Nowhere is, let's say, not respected by the other heroic players, but I feel it's still needed and it's just a good casual answer, mostly because of the Chrysalis and other mid-range threats. You can also side it in versus, for example, Elves and attack the Priest of Titania, All-Will Wisher. But it's also quite good versus Standard Bearer, which once again sees a bit of play thanks to the White Winnie. And some White Winnies play Standard Bearer in the sideboard. I have no idea why, to be honest. So this is the card I would still recommend playing. Maybe cutting one copy and playing the 6th lifelink effect in this slot could be reasonable. The last change, maybe not the change, like I decided to stay on 2 Fairy Macabres, but the decision between playing and not playing it is much closer than most people would think. In my opinion, Fairy Macabre is a solid card that answers graveyard decks like Spy or Dredge, and to some extent can answer familiars or decks with prismatic strands. But on the other hand, Standard Bearer is an elegant way to stop elves. So for example, unlike White Winnie, which can have just regular removal, you can play Standard Bearer in the deck without removal and redirect Quirion Ranger or Timberwatch Elf, which is a fine addition in my opinion. It's also solid versus Cowgates because you can either force the opponent to use Journey to Nowhere on the Standard Bearer or redirect the Basilic's Gate. So your Standard Bearer gets the pump instead of the opponent's creature with lifelink. So it's a cool addition in my opinion. Okay, so generally speaking, the deck hasn't changed much, so has the meta, because the meta is somewhat similar to what it was a few months ago. There are some changes, but they aren't very big in my opinion. So I still think Heroic is a solid choice, and I hope to prove you that I am right, and I hope to be right, and I hope to get a really good result in the Paupergeddon, and I hope that you also root for me. Okay, thank you, and see ya. And once again, if you want to check the Sideboard guide, there's a link below. Please check it out. I work really hard to make the best possible article for all the Heroic fans out there, because I hope so that you are somewhere. Okay, thank you. See ya.